Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, exploring Mao's consolidation of power. Mao's cautious policies for land reform were perhaps not surprising. He knew the peasantry well, had experience of government in Jiangxi and Yan'an, both overwhelmingly rural areas, and had won their support. The cities, though they were also a part of the Jiangxi and Yan'an Soviets, Region, the capital of Jiangxi, had a population of around 240,000. They were not natural support bases for the communists. Totally against Marxist thinking, but this is Maoism. And they held their own specific problems for the CCP. But Mao was aware of this, and even before the Civil War was over, he was saying that the centre of gravity of the party's work had shifted from the village to the city. We must do our utmost to learn how to administer and build the cities. But even though they had gained some experience at Jiangxi and Yan'an, and many of the CCP leadership had come from the city's intelligentsia, that was now 20 years ago, and they had little experience of governing and administering for cities. Indeed, they were suspicious of them. They had been the source of Kuomintang power, centres of imperial power too, spawning huge inequality and moral degradation. The communists faced little opposition, however. Such was the degree of Kuomintang misrule, corruption, arbitrary arrests and executions, the suppression of the liberal intelligentsia and too of trade unions. Communist rule could surely not be worse, and there was a willingness amongst different sections of society to work with the communists in order to help make things better. But the cities were in a desperate plight. The task facing the communists was enormous. An economy in ruin, with inflation at 25% per week, as the Kuomintang regime collapsed, to the point at which money had become virtually worthless, resulting in riots, looting and crime. Both unemployment and underemployment, severe food shortages, chronic malnutrition and related illnesses. What was termed the national bourgeoisie was the key group to which Mao held out an olive branch. This is the class of shopkeepers, small factory and workshop owners, managers of industrial or commercial enterprises, entrepreneurs. Of course, there was suspicion and mistrust on both sides, but for a time at least, each needed the other, and each had little in the way of an alternative option. The willingness to try and make it work was real. At the other end of the social strata, the lumpen proletariat, as Marx had called them, in China made up of casual coolie workers, rickshaw drivers and the like, little is actually known of their response to the communist victory, but they must have preferred it to what had gone. For them, hope must have been high. The CCP imposed its will, of course it did, on the state institutions that enforce law and order, the police, the army too, and the courts. But they also needed to administer the state and its laws. Most of the highest civil service had fled with the nationalist army, but those occupying the lower levels had largely remained and continued in their posts. Party cadres would occupy key positions, though, and ensure that party policies were followed. Similarly, organisations such as the All China Federation of Trade Unions or the All China Federation of Women fell under party control. So, control and law and order was enforced. Corruption was tackled. But none of this was particularly socialist in nature, and nor were the economic and social policies initiated in the early years of communist rule. Economic priorities included control of inflation and the introduction of a working currency, getting industry back to work, and China trading again. From a Marxist perspective, it could be seen as the advancement of a bourgeois economy, preparing the ground for the socialist economy. Or, from the Chinese context, it could be regarded as the advancement of a nationalist economy, as opposed to an imperialist one. Essentially, those first few years witnessed the advancement of a mixed economy, part capitalist, part socialist. That part of the economy owned by the bureaucratic bourgeoisie, who had mostly fled with the Kuomintang armies, large industries and commercial organisations, and the banks, were nationalised without compensation. But that still left more than 1 million small shopkeepers, artisans, and those amongst the national bourgeoisie who owned small factories and other businesses, still owning their enterprises and operating them on a profit basis. In fact, by 1953, the number of privately owned industrial firms slightly increased, and those employed in the private sector increased too. However, the private sector was closely controlled. Prices, wages, working conditions were all controlled by the state. Privately owned industries were also reliant on state-controlled producers of raw materials too, and on state trading organisations for wholesale purchases. So, another way of describing the early economy would be state capitalism. It was certainly not a liberal laissez-faire economy, but still, a bourgeoisie existed, and it lived a bourgeois lifestyle. The mixed economy or state capitalism lasted until 1952-53, when the state moved rapidly to end private ownership, nationalising or, more commonly, reconstituting privately owned businesses into joint private state enterprises. The state would assume a controlling interest in businesses and very quickly complete ownership, with the former owners encouraged to stay on in managerial roles, receiving 5% dividends on what the government calculated to be their remaining share of the capital, which could not be inherited. They no longer owned their businesses, but still profited from them. By 1956, the private sector of the economy in the cities almost ceased to exist. All that remained was artisans, small shopkeepers, and peddlers, that's door-to-door or travelling salesmen. As I said at the outset, the PRC was not advancing a bourgeois economy in order to comply with Marxist orthodoxy. They were, as had been Mao's practice from Jiangxi onwards, pragmatically consolidating their hold on power. To do that, they needed to improve the lives of the Chinese people. They needed to establish a foundation from which the economy could grow, and they needed the experience, the expertise, and the skills of the national bourgeoisie. So I hope you found that useful. And if you're finding my videos useful, do please give them a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. And do please tell your friends about it. Spread the word for me. But for now, let me thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.